Our next speaker is from a rather exotic location, that's Bothell. Actually, Nives Dolsak is someone that I contacted early on, and we specifically thought in our minds that this is someone that we wanted to bring in. And she is someone who's from the most far-reaching campuses of the University of Washington up there in the northern part of King County, up there at Bothell. And she specializes in areas of the commons and the new millennium and climate. And I want to direct you to two of the volumes in particular that she's worked in, which is The Drama of the Commons and The Commons and the New Millennium, dealing with changes and adaptation. Her work primarily focuses on global climate governance and management. So this is all the stuff that you hear about that you don't understand, but you know it's important. And Professor Dolsak is actually going to be here to tell us something about it, and hopefully you're going to leave with a little bit of an understanding. I will also say that there's no one that I've enjoyed more talking with on the phone and talking via the internet with than Nives Dolsak, who is an absolute kick and a delightful person to talk with. My pleasure, if you will.
I've contracted out the entertaining to Mark, so I'll leave that part out. Thank you all for coming here today. Stephen, thank you for having me. I've been asked to talk about the global climate change and the global climate change as a common pool resource. What I'll try to do today here in my 30 minutes of allocated common pool resource, and if I don't use all of it, I'm willing to sell extra minutes to all of you who believe in tradable permits. So what I will try to do here in my 30 allocated minutes will be first to explain why global climate change and protecting global climate is such a challenge. It's one of the most problematic things we have to handle in our lives, and our children will have to in their lives. So I'll point out three biggest challenges. Then I will talk about activities that we have been engaged in. It's not all pessimistic. We've been working very hard, both governments, intergovernmental organizations, private businesses, scholars, all of us have been trying very hard, even though Garrett Harding would tell us, forget it. It's not doable. So the second part of my presentation will be focused on what has been happening at the intergovernmental level, what has been happening in terms of bilateral cooperation, what has been happening in the US at the subnational level. I know some of you are a little skeptical, but a lot has been happening, and we have a lot of lawyers to thank for everything that has been happening at the subnational level. And I'm also going to talk about what the private sector is doing about this global common. And I will wrap up and remind you that the key challenges and things to think about when we talk and when we want to protect this particular common, which is a global common, are excludability, cooperation, auxiliary benefits, and the framing of the issues. Bear with me for one analytical minute here. What I'm talking about today in my talk, I'm just wondering, is this showing on the screen? Okay, so I'm here in the bottom left cell of my 2x2 matrix. I'm talking about common pool resources. Today we've talked about a lot of commons. We've talked about public goods and the provision of them. We have talked about toll goods, but what I am talking about today is a common pool resource, and it's a global common pool resource. It's very different from the man-made commons. It's very different from the open software because the consumption is rival. If I use a minute of the time today, Robert and Cindy and Brian will be very angry with me because I'm borrowing from their time. It's the same thing with global climate change. It doesn't appear that way when you're at the very beginning stage of the development. You can emit as much as you want, but sooner or later IPCC starts telling you, no longer emit, do not emit anymore, because we're seeing the negative outcome of the humanity using the global common pool resource as a sink for pollution. So yes, consumption is rival, which makes this for a very, very difficult common pool resource to protect. The second thing, the concept that I'm using here is a typical 2x2 prisoner dilemma game to remind you that if we are in a situation in which we are with global common pool resources, which is very similar to a pristine Swiss alpine village. Stephen has 50 heads, or he has 100 heads of cattle. I have 50 or 100. And Stephen and I are deciding how many heads are we going to send to this pristine alpine village to graze. And we know that if we both send 100, they will overgraze. And we are going to have $700 payoff each, and as a society, $1,400. And we know it would be a lot better if we just each send 50, but that means we have to restrain our milk production, you know, that cheese, the Swiss cheese that we sell, and so on. And Stephen and I say, no, why would I? The dominant outcome, the dominant strategy here is we each go with 100 heads. I'm not saying that's always happening. I'm saying it is happening in global climate change. That's the challenge. Stephen doesn't trust me, then I'm not going to drive my SUV tomorrow. So he says, what the heck, she's not going to restrain her consumption of the global common pool as a sink for her pollution, why would I? So he will go to Stephen's Pass for a skiing afternoon, even though it would have been better if he jogged. Thank you, Stephen, for letting me borrow you for making points here. The third key challenge that we see in global climate change is uncertainty. At the lunchtime, I had a pleasure of chatting with one gentleman, and he says, tell me, is it happening? I said, I'm not a climatologist, I can't tell you. Climatologists don't agree. Everybody's saying it's happening, others are saying, no, it's not happening. It's just like my weight. I step on the scale in the morning and I say, no, it's not happening. This is not 100% reliable information. If I step on the scale one more time, I'll get a different measurement. Okay? So my weight is really an uncertain information. I really can have the chocolate bar today. The same thing is happening with global climate change. We're never ever going to have 100% certain information on what's happening. The costs are uncertain, the benefits are uncertain, the extent of global climate change and the spatial distribution is uncertain. We know very little about that, and that gives us the excuse to keep borrowing from the future, right? So the three key challenges, the rivalry and non-excludability, the lack of cooperation, remember 50 versus 100 heads of cattle, and the uncertainty. Is it happening or is it not happening? Well, considering all three challenges, the literature on common pool resources will say, this is not going to happen. We will not be able to protect this global common pool resource. The tragedy will happen. And yet, if we look at what is happening, which is what I'm going to try to do here, is there's a lot happening. Is it 100% effective? No, but which international treaty is? It's a treaty without a sword. We don't have international army that would go and occupy those countries that haven't reduced greenhouse gas emissions as they promised. We don't have that, okay? So it's not a treaty that is as enforceable as domestic law. But in spite of that, we do have activities that we see implementation of this treaty across the levels. What we see happening is even before the Kyoto Protocol, we have countries coming together and financing projects that reduce emissions of greenhouse gases. No credits. Nobody could sell any minutes the way I'm hoping to at the end of my talk today. There were no credits given. It was all aid, hope for development of the technology, hope to conquer the new market, and so on. After the Kyoto Protocol, everybody's saying Kyoto Protocol's dead, nobody did anything. Well, we could say it that way, or we could say, no, but something still did happen. What happened? We did have a large number of clean development mechanisms. We did have a large number of joint implementation projects where countries came together and said, we are in this together, we will plan how we're going to reduce these emissions together. There has been a lot has been happening. So then the question is, what has really happened? If it's a regime that's not likely going to be effective, if it's a regime that creates non-excludable benefits, so why go there? If it's a regime that does not sanction non-compliance, it's doomed to fail, right? In addition, it's the regime in which the largest current contributor, which is United States, is not there, right? US pulled itself out after the Kyoto and said, we don't care. So what is happening? What is driving this regime's implementation? What I've looked at or what I've looked with some of my colleagues at, is how have we implemented the regime? And we see that clearly there are some countries that have done nothing. There are some countries that at least have plans to do something about global climate change. Well, that's something, at least they're not ignoring it. It's 49 of those countries. There's 37 who have project-level mitigation. They don't have country-wide emission reduction targets, but they say, in air conditioning, in my particular industry, I will reduce emissions. There are 9 countries that have regular inventories. How much am I using of this common pool resource? That's an important part, because you're exposing yourself to the criticism, to the monitoring and the criticism of the world. You're telling the world, this is how much of your common I'm using. So it's an important part, and we have countries who do this regularly. We have 28 countries who have either sector-wide or country-wide mitigation projects. I'm not going to get too much into the model details. I'm not going to get into the quantitative results too much. If you're interested in the numbers, please email me and I'll be happy to share those. But I do want to tell you everything that I'm talking about is based on empirical analysis of a fairly large number of countries. Here, in terms of implementation of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, we've looked at implementation since 1997. Looked about 127 countries. Here are the results. What we are seeing here is the orange things are the most interesting, and what we're seeing is that local air pollution is one of the important factors. So who are the countries that engage in protection of global commons? The same countries that have huge local air pollution problems. Why? Because they do it for local pollution, not for global. That's what I would argue. So what we are seeing in countries and subnational entities that do implement global climate change policies is they do it for what I would call auxiliary benefits, not for the global climate change benefits. They're uncertain, the extent is uncertain, all those things. We're doing it for auxiliary benefits. We're doing it where we are a democratic society and when our population demands action. That's when we do it. That's when we implement global climate change policies. So the tragedy can be averted, even though even the suggestions of the theoretical literature and empirical literature at the local levels, at local and regional levels, would be very pessimistic. But we see that the global community is doing something about it. Let's look at bilateral projects. I am an actor in a developed country. By actor meaning not a movie actor, but an actor, somebody who decides what he or she or they will do about their greenhouse gas emissions. The option they have is that they find a partner overseas in a developing country. Why in a developing country? Because the costs are lower there. The costs of reducing greenhouse gas emissions are potentially lower in a developing country. So what we see is actors in developed countries looking overseas for options of reducing greenhouse gas emissions at a lower cost and funding those projects, using their money and funding those projects. What happened before Kyoto was experimental activities implemented jointly, right? Nobody could claim any credit. Everybody's kind of feeling the place, trying to understand how these things will work, how high are transaction costs, and so on. After the Kyoto Protocol, the rules of the protocol, and the Kyoto Protocol and the Marrakech Accord allowed for exchange of credits. So if Shell were to invest in a company in Mexico that reduced greenhouse gas emissions, Shell would get to claim the credits for it and could say, we've reduced greenhouse gas emissions. The question then is, who engages in these exchanges and why? Where do we see them? And how do countries decide where to go? Why do they go to Mozambique but not Namibia? Why do they go to China a lot more than they go to India, and so on? Home country has a lot of rationales for doing these projects, mainly to feeling out the target, to see the target market, to explore if they can expand the technologies they already have into different markets. Host country gains new technology, potentially gains some development aid, and also very frequently has increased availability of energy. Who's been doing these projects while they were still experimental? US was pretty much at the top. Only Sweden had more projects than we've had. These are the countries on the other end hosting these projects. The green ones are the ones that actually were chosen. The blue ones are the ones that could have been chosen. So there's a lot of countries that were involved in that. We're not just all sitting and waiting and borrowing for the future. Again, the empirical analysis here is we've looked at the presence or absence of a project in a dyad. We took a developed country, took a developing country. We've done that for all the possible dyads, and we've looked at where projects have happened. And what we've seen is that these projects follow the usual pattern. These projects were going to countries that we've traded with before. These projects were going to countries that we gave aid to before. They were not necessarily going to the countries that were the worst part of the problem, right? They were going to places that we were familiar with, that we had really low transaction costs with. And these are the conclusions of where these projects were hosted. What's happening at the subnational level? Some of us are very pessimistic and for 8 years have been yearning to see something happen at the national level. At the same time, a lot has been happening at the subnational level. Lawyers were really pushing. We have to create excludability for this common, or else the common will not survive. EPA, you have to regulate. Bush, you have to do something. In industry, you have to do something. So as I said before, lawyers have been extremely active in this arena. But it's not just lawyers. We've seen a lot of states, state governments, enact global climate change policies. And you would think this is ridiculous, right? You make your state more expensive, and industry will just move elsewhere, right? Boeing is threatening to move because of congestion, let alone if we impose really high taxes on fossil fuels. So why did states do that? And a particular issue that was of our interest here is, what is the media saying? And does that have an impact or not? And the reason we were very interested in the media and what media has to say about it is that there's a lot that we as lay people don't know about climate change, okay? We don't read IPCC reports, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. We don't, right? That's usually not our reading that's on the side desk before we go off to sleep. What we do is, we do read newspapers, or some of you would say read blogs, okay? So we have that information filtered for us through journalists. And what journalists have been taught is the golden standard of balanced reporting. You report this, but you also report the other side. But that's terrible for an uncertain common, common that we're trying to protect. We will always have the excuse of not doing anything. So what we looked at in this particular project is whether media does have an impact on what states have been doing in terms of global climate change. Here are some of the hypotheses in a good social science manner. I've outlined these for you, but I'm not going to have time to go through everything. This is the model. Particularly, we were interested in media coverage, and that is what's the tone of the narrative that we see in media. We've also controlled for problem severity, for political ideology, thinking that left-leaning states will be more likely to have these policies. We've also looked at institutional capacity, that is professionalism of the legislature, saying the more professional the legislature is, the more likely they'll have the time and the resources to study these issues and enact policies. These are the states that we looked at, that we read newspapers from. And the green boxes are the number of climate change policies that these states have enacted in the 8 years that we studied. So we've had a lot of variation. Our dependent variable was legislative activity, which we read off of their state legislature homepages, as well as EPA for the early years. This is how we coded newspaper. This is a very tricky issue. For the drunk driving, you will never, ever see a newspaper author saying, oh, well, it's actually good to drink a little just before you drive, because then you're less nervous. And especially if you're a beginning driver, you should really have a couple of drinks, because then you'll be a lot more relaxed when you drive. Okay? You don't see that. In global climate change, you do see that. It's not that they're advocating that you emit more greenhouse gas emissions, but what the balanced reporting standard is, if there is a person in Arizona who's a respected climatologist and who says this is not happening, you report about it. Okay? So it's extremely important how the reporting goes and what people read. And we've developed our own system of coding. And what we found is that indeed it matters a lot what is written in the media. If media says we do need a policy, soon after, a few years later, we were lagging by 6 months, because that's what the literature tells us is the lag period, we see a lot of policies enacted. If there is a counter policy narrative saying this is going to cost us so much and it's really uncertain and we have other problems to worry about, such as unemployment and the lack of health insurance, then we don't have global climate change policy. I'm not passing a normative statement here, I'm just reporting on my findings here. Some of my specification checks here. So essentially, what media writes is extremely important when the issue is so uncertain as the case is in global climate change. So the last, I think the last part that I want to talk about is private sector projects. Even, well, less so in the US, since we had this absence of national regulation, but all over the world, private sector is investing overseas in projects that reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So the question is, where did it go? Why? What factors impact their decision? This is the list of the countries that have hosted or have been hosting clean development mechanisms, everything from Armenia to Vietnam, and obviously they host different numbers of projects. The key question I wanted to ask here is, do institutions matter? I'm an institutionalist, even though I'm not a legal scholar. I'm a social scientist who's interested in rules. I'm a scholar of Elinor Ostrom, so I look at how rules impact behavior and outcomes. So what we were looking here is rules. We were looking at how do countries who are hosting these projects, how prepared they are for these projects. Have they participated in activities implemented jointly before? Have they sent in the inventories? Is there anything that they have done to prove that they have the institutional setup to run these projects? Another thing that I was very interested in is familiarity. What's the familiarity of the investor with the home, or with the country that would host the project? Where have there been colonial ties in the past that would clearly make it, that would clearly increase the familiarity with the institutions in host countries? Whether they've been patrons of bilateral trade in the past, whether they've been patrons of bilateral aid in the past. All of them trying to understand how much familiarity and how much transaction costs may be driving these decisions. Again, we've looked at all possible diets. We had about 2,058 cases of diets. We looked at information for about 3 years. And what we've seen is that the variables that capture for us the familiarity are extremely important. So it does matter whether the host country is attractive or not, whether it's a large economy, whether it emits a lot, and so on. But what's also important is, have we been there before? Have we written their constitution? Have we traded with them? Have we given them aid? Why is that important? If we've given them aid and we've seen that it works, it doesn't disappear, it doesn't go for bribes, then we're a lot more comfortable going in those countries. So as an institutionalist or a person who's interested in laws and regulations, we could say familiarity reduces transaction costs. So transaction costs are extremely important in these projects. These projects are not something brand new. When we look at cooperation in global climate change, we're not starting the world all over again. We're using the established pattern. We're going where we've been before. We're not going to places they need it most. We're going to places that we're familiar with, which is fine. That's how it functions. That's what makes it low cost. But it doesn't necessarily mean that we are doing exactly what the Kyoto Protocol wanted us to do, which is to give certain countries development aid. Okay? But again, very few international treaties are 100% effective. Here are some other specification checks for our CDM project. So what I would like to conclude my presentation with is that when we talked about excludability before today, it was the bad word. We didn't want to exclude people from commons because those were man-made commons. And it was very easy to produce them, or rather we had non-zero marginal costs. We didn't really talk about the fixed costs, but let's leave that for the evening tonight. Here, we do have to exclude, or else we won't protect the commons. So it's a very different situation. Private sector has found its own ways. Even though we don't have national regulation, private sector has used the approach of green clubs. If I just advertise and if I get some certificates, people will believe me and they'll buy my products because I'm the green responsible company. We've seen a lot of bilateral cooperation, which is not new, which essentially repeats the established patterns of trade and aid. We've learned that because of uncertainty is so high here, it's extremely important how you and a journalist talks about these issues, right? We cannot talk about what we're going to do is going to reduce global climate change. That won't do it. That will not be enough. We need to talk about auxiliary benefits. We need to talk about reduced local air pollution. We need to talk about diversifying energy portfolio and no longer relying on a particular part of the world for our fossil fuel resources, and so on. Because of the high uncertainty, because of a lack of excludability and rivalry and so on, we have to rely on auxiliary benefits. And this is where I'd like to end. Thank you.